And welcome back to Face the Nation. Senator Jeff Sessions is the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee. He's in the studio with us this morning. Senator Bill Nelson of Florida joins us from Orlando. Well, Senator Sessions, let me start with you. The Secretary of the Treasury says he thinks that there will be a deal. Do you think there's going to be a deal?
There needs to be a deal by August 2nd. I assume he's accurate on that date. Will it be a deal that's really good for America? Will it do the things that we need to do? Will it put our Medicare and Social Security on a sustained, sound basis for the indefinite future? I doubt it now. The Republican leadership, I have to say, have been open about this, asking and pleading with the president. In the last few days, he seemed to open up to the possibility of a long-term debt fix. But it looks like now that that's fallen apart based on demands for higher taxes.
So if they can't get a deal, and you seem to be saying, because, you know, I would take it if you think it's a bad deal, I take it you're not going to go for it. If you think there's not going to be a deal here, then what happens? Will they just have to go to one of these short-term things on raising the debt ceiling? In other words, pass something to allow the government to borrow for another month or so, or 6 months, or something like that?
I would assume so, Bob. I have been arguing for months that we should be doing this publicly in the constitutional process so the American people could see what's going on. We're not just going to ratify some secret deal, even if our good leaders plop it down on the floor of the Senate. We need at least 7 days to review something as historic as this. So I'm really worried about all of that. I really believe we need a national discussion. You know, we had a terrible jobs report this week. This debt is right now pulling the economy down. The Rogoff-Reinhardt study that Secretary Geithner agrees with said pulls down our debt. Our debt pulls down our growth by 1%, which is equal to 1 million jobs, from 2% to 3% we would have had in growth first quarter, except for the debt. So we've got to do something because the crisis is now, and the problem is Washington is spending, surging spending, and we've got to bring that down.
Let me just ask you this flat question. Do you think right now that, that Republicans have the votes to pass an agreement, even if Speaker Boehner comes out and says, I've agreed with the president on this? I don't know whether Speaker Boehner has the votes amongst the Republicans in the House to pass something like that.
Well, depending on what the agreement is, that's the answer. Yeah. If he's got tax increases, like the Senate budget that just leaked out, the Democrats have not made it public, but their outline was made public. It has $2 of tax increases for every $1 of spending cuts. That's minuscule, and $4 trillion really is far too little. We're talking about only 5% reduction in the growth of our spending when you cut the spending over 10 years, $4 trillion.
You heard what Secretary Geithner said. He says there is no alternative to doing this without some sort of revenue increase. That's not acceptable to you, I take it.
That absolutely is not correct. We have increased discretionary non-defense spending 24% in the last 2 years. We've been increasing defense spending. We've been increasing Social Security, Medicare, and all at 7% or so a year increases. You can make big reductions in spending without cutting spending, just reducing the growth rate of spending. We're on this idiotic idea that we should judge cuts based on how much it reduces the growth of spending. American people, if we focused on does it actually increase or reduce spending, we'd have a much more honest approach to the difficulties we face.
I want to get to Senator Nelson, who's down in Orlando this morning, a senator from Florida and a former astronaut. Senator,
good morning, Bill.
You're hearing what Senator Sessions is talking about on cutting spending, but I got to ask you, it seems to me like that Speaker Pelosi pretty much laid down the law about how Democrats feel about making any changes in Social Security and the entitlement programs. And a lot of people say unless you get into that, there's no way you can get a realistic deal. How do you feel? Would you vote for a plan if they said we're going to have to reduce Social Security benefits or any of these entitlements?
Well, Bob asked the question first, how did we get into this problem of the big deficit? And it's basically a fall off of revenues and an increase in spending. So you got to correct that imbalance. Otherwise, you're not doing real deficit reduction. And we've got to hit something like $4 trillion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years. And I'm coming to your question in just a second, but I want to lay the predicate. There are lots of ways to get additional revenue by eliminating some of these tax preferences for special interests called tax loopholes. And I want to make an offer to Jeffrey, who is my dear friend, that if you took the money that the federal government would save from all of those tax loopholes and instead use that to lower all of the tax levels of the different tax brackets, what you'd have is a revenue neutral position, but because you would simplify the tax code, you would end up raising more revenue because it would spur up the engine of economic growth. And now to your question about Social Security. Bob, you don't have to touch Social Security to do what I just said, and even if you touch Social Security, that's not going to help in this next decade to get the deficit reduction that we need.
Well, quickly, Senator, what's your response?
Well, it's a great position, and I would support that. But that's not what the Democratic Senate budget that has been revealed partially to us does. It increases taxes by reducing these loopholes and increases other taxes and actually spends the money rather than using it to reduce rates. That's not acceptable. And what's happened is this government has surged spending. The numbers of 24% increase in spending do not include the stimulus package of almost $1 trillion. Right. And so they want to now demand the American people pay more money to fund these increasingly high rates of spending, and that's the big difference. American people expect us to bring the spending down to reasonable levels before they're asked to pay more taxes.
Jeffrey, I just want to say this, Bob. Jeffrey, you've got to acknowledge that part of our deficit problem was the huge Bush tax cuts in the early part of the decade. That accounted by what was handed off to the new administration of over $1 trillion of annual deficit. That accounted for almost half of it. So if you're going to be real about the numbers, you're going to have to address these kind of things.
Well, that's not accurate, Bill. The revenue went up every single year after those tax cuts were put in. The revenue is down now because of the low economy. You're right about that, and I would agree. So the question is, well, it's not because taxes have been cut in recent years, it's because people are not making money and they're not paying as much taxes. So increasing taxes on that weakened economy is not the way to increase revenue at this time, which I thought we agreed on last December.
Senator, let me, Senator Nelson.
Jeffrey, I didn't say raise the taxes. I said eliminate some of those tax giveaways that aren't doing anything. And there's a bunch of cash out there that's stashed overseas that ought to be taxed as income because it's an American income. You do a combination of those things and you can do some real changes here.
Well, if you used it to lower rates, I'm all with you. If you use it, as the president suggests, for more spending, I'm against it.
All right, gentlemen, I'm very sorry the clock's run out here. We have to end the discussion here. Senator Nelson, sorry I didn't get to ask you about the space program because you're a former astronaut, but we ran out of time. We'll be back in a moment with some final thoughts.